The rent is too damn high. That's pretty easy for a politician to say, but for the first time in 40 years, City Council voted to limit rent hikes and eliminate extra surcharges for the city's rent stabilized ordinance, which determines how much rent is allowed to increase for the majority of rental units in Los Angeles. Here are 5 key changes. The minimum increase is now going to be 1% versus 3% before. This might be the biggest change because for decades, rents were allowed to increase by 3% even when inflation was less than 3%. That happened 23 years over the past 30 years. Now, the maximum allowable increase, depending on inflation, will be 4%, down from a possible maximum of 10%, which will prevent the steepest rent hikes in high inflation years like 2022. Third, the new formula takes 90% of inflation when calculating these increases, as opposed to 100% before. This is because housing costs are already factored into inflation calculations. So when you allow rents to increase, you're inherently pushing up the overall cost of living. Fourth, we eliminated the loophole that allowed an extra 1 to 2% rent hike if a landlord pays for gas and electricity. This will have the most direct impact for tenants next year if your landlord pays utilities, because now they'll only be able to raise your rent by 4%, the maximum, instead of 6% under the older formula. And last but not least, we got rid of an outrageous provision that allowed for a 10% rent hike if someone has a second child or a loved one moved in. So what does this all mean for you as a renter? Rent stabilized tenants can have their rents raised by a maximum of 4% next year. And you can always check if you live in a rent stabilized unit by texting RSO to 855-880-7368. For other renters, state law limits rent increases to 9% for the next year. Check out part 2 of our recap, where we cover our motions to address police responses to protests.